Hello. So this is this week's video for Intro to Sociology. So one thing, if you're watching this video this week, realize that the week is technically off. This is Easter week, Holy Week, and because we didn't normally have class the last half of the week, I didn't put a discussion board up. So technically anything that you do from here will be due next Wednesday, not this Wednesday. It's the Wednesday after Easter. So the Wednesday after Easter, post will be due Friday, replies. So so that is that's what we have coming up. So okay, first of all, good work again. I liked a lot of the discussions. I felt like you guys really dug into some of the meat of the article on biology, the biology of history. One thing I was really glad to see is you guys breaking down these sort of distinctions between us and the environment, between society and biology, because I think that's really what the sociology of medicine is kind of all about. So you guys kind of are hitting at the core of it. The way in which we write ourselves onto the physical world, but the way in which we do that having unintended consequences that in turn affect us that we never would have predicted, right? There's a philosophy that's particularly influential, not only in the social sciences, but in the humanities in general, as well as the arts. And that's a philosophy of somebody by the name of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. That's Hegel, H-E-G-E-L. And in particular, Hegel is the modern form of something we call dialectics. So dialectics is the study of tensions between things and how these tensions create change over time. So a lot of times what we view as like a binary category, this or that. Dialectics would want to claim like, no, those things really co-affect one another over time. You just have to watch them, right? So you see that with us and our environment. Our relationship is dialectical, meaning that our environment shapes us, we shape our environment shapes us. You know, we have the ability to act upon our environment, to change and alter it, but we often can't do that with sort of perfect knowledge or the ability to predict what's going to happen. So it produces unintended consequences. It's true both of us as individuals and as us as a society. You could also read our relationship with our society much the same way, right? These different tensions. So if you think about what you guys were saying in the discussion board, I think you were picking up on that, right? That there's a dialectical tension, in this case between microbial organisms and human beings, right? That we may take antibiotics, right? And that'll have an effect on them, but they in turn will have an effect on us, right? And so back and forth. So nice to see you guys, in short, breaking down those tensions. Okay, so for either, you know, this week if you wanted to post this week or next week if you want to post next week, we're talking about sociology of the environment. Is going to be our particular focus. And you know, the article on the discussion board is the one you're going to be doing. It's yes. It is Bruce's Frankenfish, or Fish to Feed the World, Scientism in Biotechnology Regulatory Policy. So basically it is a discussion of the politics behind this particular case where you have a genetically modified organism, the social reaction to it, versus the way in which companies try to promote it within the government. And so here I want us to sort of keep in mind what the article is interested in versus what the article isn't interested in. So the article is not going to be interested in whether or not genetically modified organisms are bad for us. It's not a medical article. It's not a health article. What it is going to be interested in is the way in which we talk about science in this context and how that's going to inform our politics. And in the title itself, it uses this word scientism, and I think we should probably focus a little bit on what is scientism versus what is science, is a way of sort of setting it up. So let's start with science. What makes something science is sort of twofold. So one, a science is based off of observation. So whether you're talking about a social science, whether you're talking about, physical sciences, the sciences we normally think of as sciences, right? Or behavioral sciences, things like psychology, they're all based on observation. Specific rules for making observations, and then basing your conclusions off of what you find. Methodological observation. That's going to be the first one. The second one, what we often don't think about, is refutability. So what makes something science is that, in essence, if I make a claim on the basis of methodological observation, careful, good observation, it doesn't necessarily mean it's right. Instead, what really makes science work is the fact that anything that a scientist says in a study could be refuted, could be changed. That further study may render the conclusions false. This means that good scientists, a good chunk of the time, are wrong. They're supposed to be wrong. It's how it works. This is the principle of refutability, which makes, in a lot of ways, science the opposite of what we often want to think about it. It makes science a particularly unstable form of knowledge. It's not knowledge that protects itself. It's knowledge that is up for grabs. And we can kind of think of the last article, right, as a good example of this. For the longest time, we understood change in organisms. We've understood it through this sort of very clear, like long-scale Darwinian way, right? So we would have understood it as sort of like the buildup of change as a result of genetic reformation, and then as a result of that sort of natural selection, right? That was for a long time the narrative we had about how organisms evolve. And in the short term, we've seen a lot of other forms of evolution happening. So we see things like what the article was talking about, which is latent gene transfer, right? Essentially that old model of a one way of evolving, right, was up for grabs. And now we have a far more complicated view of how things evolve, right? This is how science generally works. So that means, once again, that a lot of times good science will still be wrong. And there's a lot of examples of this. For a long time, before we understood light as we understand it now as a form of energy, light was supposed to have a substance. This was particularly in the 19th century. There's a lot of good, very methodological studies that followed the rules of the science at the time around something called a luminous ether, which was at the time supposed to create light. Since we've moved on, those things have been refuted. It didn't mean that the scientists that were doing that work were wrong. Well, it means that they were wrong, but it doesn't mean that their science was bad. They weren't pseudoscientists. Pseudoscientists, rather than being based off of irrefutability and method, are based off of the feeling of being scientific, right? So you will have things that are not particularly methodological, but sound sciencey. These would be things more like phrenology, right? Phrenology was bad science when it was science, which makes it very different from something like the studies of the luminous ether, or even like stuff on Martians in astronomy. It followed all the basic methods of astronomy at the time, and it was refuted, right? It allowed itself to be refuted. It was refuted within a fairly short period of time, particularly the work of Percival Lowell in the canals of Mars, right? Lowell wasn't a bad scientist. In fact, a lot of the things we know about Mars today were discovered by Lowell using the exact same methods. So getting back to the point, right, science is built off of methodological observation and refutability. Scientism is in some ways closer to pseudoscience than it is actual science. Scientism is the narrative we have about science. So when people talk about things like trusting in science, that would be scientism, not science. It has nothing to do with method. It has nothing to do, right, with refutability. It has to do with a narrative, what postmodernists would like to call a grand narrative, right, about what science does. Or understanding history as a form of progress as a result of science would be scientism, not science. It's in some ways a faith that sort of surrounds science, but we should be careful about. Particularly as scientists, we should be careful about it. Another good example of scientism is technological determinism. Anytime people try to explain cultural or social change through changes in technology, that treats technology and scientific method as the driver of history, is the thing that moves us forward, rather than a series of questions being answered, right, that are relevant to our time. Once again, this is a form of scientism. You can't prove scientific progress. You can't prove things like technological determinism. They're not based on scientific observation themselves. They're things that people believe in. And so, how does scientism, how does a belief in science alter policy? So the article is going to find two of these, one of which is going to be that scientism produces what could be called co-opted authority. A lot of times people want to use science more as a weapon to beat opponents over the head with, which ironically treats it as quite the opposite of science. So if we think that by sort of leaning on science, scientific discoveries or scientific journals or things that the work that scientists has done to say, no, this is completely true, this is stable knowledge, this will always be true, this is irrefutable, right? Irrefutable data, irrefutable observation. Essentially, we've denied science its actual purpose, right? Its refutability. So what we see there is often when we co-opt science as a form of authority, which is sometimes done by the government, sometimes done by corporations, sometimes just done by people in conversation, right? That is an example of us using scientism, a belief in science, as opposed to using actual scientific observation. It often shuts down observation. A lot of the things that we will be saying, and this is true, like science, another way to put it is science is a discourse. Science is always a continuing conversation. It's never over and complete as a project, so the knowledge that it constructs is never complete. So when we use it that way, we're using scientism. And also, like people recognize that authority. People recognize that it's being used as a political tool, so it often creates resistance, things like forms of alternative science, things like that. So that's what our article is going to be looking at for either next week or the week after. So I'll look forward to hearing your more detailed discussions of it, and then I'll point out things that you guys bring out that I like or think is interesting, or as well as things that I thought got missed. So otherwise, have a great week, be safe, and hope to hear from you soon. Talk to you later. Bye.